20th century South Africa. His first book, Twice the Work of Free Labor, examines the role of convict leasing and chain gangs in the remaking of the American South in half-century after the Civil War. Subsequently, he has written extensively about race relations in the US labor movement, interracial agrarian radicalism, early civil rights struggles, and the impact of anti-communism on the labor and civil rights movements in both US and South Africa. He recently published two books, Margaret Borke White and the Dawn of the Apartheid, based on a photography exhibited he curated at IU in South Africa, and Marked, Unmarked, Remembered, a geography of American memory, a collaboration with his brother, photojournalist Andrew Lichtenstein. He has two research projects in the works. One, Trouble in Paradise, Labor Radicalism, Race Relations, and Anti-Communism in Florida, 1940 to 60, explores the interplay of civil rights and labor movements in Florida during the 1940s. The other examines the history of Black workers and industrial relations in 20th century South Africa and is tentatively entitled Making Apartheid Work. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lichtenstein. Alex, take it away, please.
Thank you, Raj. Hello, all. Bear with me. I'll try and share my screen in a moment. Although ostensibly the topic is post-apartheid South Africa, as Raj pointed out, I cobbled this together at the last minute, substituting for a colleague. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is South Africa under apartheid rather than after apartheid, but that will leave plenty of room for questions at the end. And before I start, have any of you been to South Africa? Maybe raise your hand on the screen if you have. I know Raj has. We just had this interesting discussion, but anyone else? Doesn't look like it. Okay. All right, I'm going to try share screen now and we'll see how this goes. Yes. All right, you all can see that.
Yes, I saw that just now.
All right.
Thank you.
So let me begin with a fable. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful, sorry, my screen here is not working. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful country, largely uninhabited. Immigrants from Europe, from the Netherlands, from England, from France and Germany too, arrived in this land, and they spread out across the abundant territory and essentially made it bloom and brought it to life as pioneers, essentially, right? So this would be similar to what we see in the United States, perhaps, or perhaps it sounds like I might even be talking about the United States. After 200 years, however, a discovery was made. And that discovery was that though the land was rich, what lay underneath the land promised untold riches to those able to raise the capital to dig it up from the ground. Diamonds, the largest ever discovered in the world. Gold, the largest gold deposits known to humankind. This enormous wealth was under the earth. I'm getting an echo, I think.
Somebody's talking in the background. Please mute your microphones.
Was under the earth for those able to dig it up. But naturally enough, the Europeans squabbled over who had the ultimate right to these riches and whose descendants would be able to dig it up. The descendants of the Dutchmen who had settled 200 years ago and their independent republics, or the descendants of the English speakers and their empire. All right, so these two forces, descendants of the Dutch, descendants of the English speakers, came to blows over who would have the rights to the minerals under the ground. After a bloody series of battles, peace was made, a new nation was created, bringing together those who had been at odds, who had agreed finally, and what you're looking at now is the famous capital of this country, the Union Building, which joined together what were called the two races, the English speakers and the Dutch speakers. And they peaceably were able to begin to exploit the wealth under the ground. During World War II, the new Union, fought bravely on the side of the Allies, defending democracy against fascism, and a great statesman was thrown up. And after the war, this statesman was instrumental in helping to found the United Nations organization, and indeed in crafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Because of the great wealth extracted from the ground, this country soon became a model of modern post-war economic growth and development. Its people prospered, life expectancy increased, consumption expanded rapidly, great cities grew up on top of the riches underground, new factories opened up, foreign investment flowed into the coffers of the country. By the mid-1960s, the growth rate of this country was an extraordinary 8% annually, one of the fastest growing economies in the world of that decade, of that great post-war decade of growth. I think only Japan rivaled it. During that entire decade, that is 1960 to 1970, the GDP growth rate, that is the annual growth rate, never dipped below 4%. Many of this country's citizens lived in nice homes with swimming pools, owned their own car, had refrigerators and other consumer durables, traveled the globe on their passports, and generally enjoyed an extraordinarily comfortable and high standard of living by any standards. That's the fable. Why is this a fable? Because in fact, as must be obvious by now, the country I'm talking about was South Africa, or particularly white South Africa, for which this paradisical account was essentially true. But that was only 20% at most of the country's population, its European descendants. The other 80% of the population was African, right? Indian, people who'd come from South Asia, and mixed race people. And actually the image I show you here, since Raj mentioned it, I did this, curated an exhibit of photographs that were taken in 1950, right at essentially the dawn of apartheid in South Africa by Margaret Bourke-White. And let me go back here, actually, I think it's worth, that image in the center, right, that circular image in the center is at the celebration of the inauguration of what's called the Voortrekker Monument, which was the great monument to white South Africa, akin, I would say, to a Confederate monument in the American South. And Bourke-White was at the inauguration of this monument in 1949 and took this picture to suggest how white South Africans were living it up, and that this was the apotheosis of the great possibility of their post-war consumer society. The Coca-Cola sign, as you'll see, is quite significant, I think, for thinking about international business. But Bourke-White also took these kind of pictures, and the one on the left is actually what was going on behind the scenes at the inauguration of the Voortrekker Monument, attended by 250,000 Afrikaners, the descendants of the original Dutch settlers of Southern Africa. And of course, those people had to be fed. And you can see who, in fact, was feeding them, African women doing the labor. Because the paradise of wealth, consumption, and ease experienced by white South Africans in the post-World War II period rested on the exploited labor of 80% of the population. Of those Africans, Indians, and mixed race people who had been stripped of all rights, including voting rights, denied access to the country's riches and wealth, segregated in impoverished urban ghettos or desolate rural reserves, required to carry a pass to move from place to place or to get a job, and subjected to a comprehensive and totalistic system of racial domination known as apartheid. Right? Unknown in anywhere else in the post-war world, except perhaps Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, Texas, you get the idea, okay? But it was a pretty severe system. 95, and the statistic that I always use that really brought this home to me was the UN did a study of South African consumption patterns circa, I think it's 1969 or 1970, where they discovered that 95% of white homes in South Africa owned a refrigerator. Okay, so typical modern Western level of comfort, convenience, and consumption. Only 2% of Black homes in South Africa owned a refrigerator at the same time, let alone electricity or running water, right? So the gulf between people living a modern life that would have been familiar to any person coming from the West or any relatively middle-class, prosperous person coming from the West, and the vast majority of the people in the country, that gulf was extraordinary, as it is globally then and even now. But of course, the two systems were directly side by side, and indeed, in a quite visible way, depended upon one another. Now, apartheid lasted officially from 1948, which is when the Afrikaner nationalists came to power, although of course there's plenty of segregation before that, from 1948 until 1994. It was an extraordinarily complex system of racial domination and exploitation, and one I really don't have time to explore in depth here, though I'm happy to entertain questions. And so too, the movement against apartheid, both locally and globally, akin in scope, I would say, in worldwide importance to the abolitionist movement against slavery during the 19th century. That movement against apartheid cannot be summarized in 30 minutes, but most of you, of course, know its most famous figure. Whoops, where did that go? Okay, who has thankfully cast a long shadow over Jan Smutz as the great statesman. There's Jan Smutz, and of course, most of you know this figure, Nelson Mandela, who has, so again, thinking about the trajectory of apartheid, in 1946, Jan Smutz, the famous general, the leader of South Africa during World War II on the side of the Allies, one of the foundational members of the United Nations, really a world leader in 1945, 1946. The transition from Jan Smutz to Nelson Mandela is probably the most recognizable figure on the world stage between, let's say, 1990 and 2010. That is a dramatic transformation in South African imagery, in world politics, and indeed in the international business climate, which I'm going to get to in a minute. And the image on the lower left here is, again, those same union buildings, which in 1910 were described as bringing together the two races of South Africa, meaning the British and the Dutch. Now the union buildings still stand as the seat of government in South Africa, but of course they're graced by this enormous statue of Nelson Mandela with his arms wide open, not just to the two races, of which, of course, that was a myth, but really, I would say, to global humanity. Or, if you like, you guys could think, hello, this is South Africa, we're open for business again, which I'll get to in a minute. But that has always been a very striking image, that Mandela now stands as the world historic figure on the South African stage, replacing Smutz, who, despite his UN street cred, was an avid and committed racist and segregationist. And indeed, this is just an aside, but it's very interesting. At the very moment that Smutz was sitting down in San Francisco to discuss the Charter on Human Rights, the introduction, the preamble to the United Nations, he was busy making sure that legislation in South Africa designed what was called the Ghetto Act, to segregate people of Indian descent in South Africa. He had to reassure his deputy in South Africa, Jan Hofmeyr, to make sure this got signed and passed, because he was at that point Prime Minister of South Africa as well. So, so the hypocrisy, if you want to call it that, or the contradiction between Smutz's world role and his domestic one couldn't have been greater. And he wasn't even the person who implemented apartheid. He was defeated in the 1948 election as being insufficiently racist and segregationist. So there's some powerful ironies here. Okay, so What I do want to suggest to you, though, that if that potted history of white South Africa that I began with, the fable, is false, is a fable, I do want to suggest to you that the rise and fall historically of the system of apartheid can be understood. I hope this fits the agenda of what you guys are discussing today, can be understood as a parable, essentially, for the great dilemmas thrown up by the question of doing business in a globalized world. First of all, because the great wealth generated in South Africa, the physical material itself that in fact underlay the world's gold standard in the first part of the century, that great wealth fundamentally rested on the colonial dispossession of Africans and Asians. This was no anomaly in the first half of the 20th century. That's why Smutz could be celebrated as a world statesman despite his segregationist street cred, or maybe because of it, at the formation of the United Nations in 1946, which of course was not the United Nations we know today, which is mostly European countries that still retained colonies in the global South. All right. So let me give just a few images here to sort of puncture the fable I gave. Of course, as you all know or would have guessed, the land that the great Dutch and British pioneers spread across in southern Africa was not empty. It was possessed by, or maybe that's the wrong word, inhabited by indigenous peoples who had to be defeated in battle, slaughtered, corralled, and controlled before the land could be used by Europeans. Moreover, once minerals were discovered to generate the enormous wealth of 20th century South Africa, they didn't come out of the ground from magic. All that capital that people like Cecil Rhodes had to invest in the gold mines and diamond mines was worthless unless there was cheap, exploitable labor to dig it up. Someone had to do that work, and that someone was always dispossessed African peoples in South Africa, indeed from all over Southern Africa, in a cruel and distinctive migrant labor system. And apartheid itself rested and indeed codified an enormous disparity between great wealth and abject poverty, as I suggested before. So those living standards of white South Africans that are so impressive and appealing and naturalizing in the fable of the 1960s and 1970s cannot be understood without reference to these images of how the vast majority of Black, brown, and Indian people in South Africa lived at the time. And it's not that this was an accident, right? That those two systems operated in tandem and depended upon one another. Okay, so now let me think about this as a parable, though. Okay, so as I said, first of all, part of the parable is that up until the World War II period, this was not an anomaly. That is the creation of wealth through colonial exploitation of the global South. Yet at that very same moment, let's say 1945-46, a moment of celebration because of the defeat of fascism, that coincided with a new global transformation. Again, as I think most of you know, but this is the moment in which the formerly colonized people begin to emerge on the world stage. And indeed, to the degree that Smutz met opposition to what was going on in South Africa when he stood up at the United Nations, that opposition came from the new government of India, right? Which had formerly been part of the British Empire, but was in the midst of becoming independent in 1946, 1947, and had many people, citizens, or at least descendants of citizens, living in South Africa. And so the new nation of India was really the first to stand up in the United Nations and object to the treatment of Indian people in South Africa. That was a real powerful sign, I think, of new kids on the block. That is, these newly independent states, which were demanding an equal share of the wealth generated by the labor of their people or the resources in their ground or in their community. And this is a moment after 1946 in which you have really the development of what are known today, I guess, in the parlance of a lot of the classes you guys teach, and I've talked to IU, Kelley School people about this, emerging market economies, right? So this is the origin, I would say, the historical origin of what today gets called, I think in a rather euphemistic or anodyne fashion, the emerging market economy. That emerging market economy in South Africa is certainly the case here, is often built on the detritus of a formerly colonial system. Right? And I do think for anyone who's trying to engage in business and business education in these places, that's the first thing you have to understand in terms of the structure of the political economy, in terms of the rhetoric, and in terms of the consciousness of many of the people doing business in those places. So South Africa, I think, is a really good parable or example of that. Perhaps one of the most powerful ones, precisely because I've lectured at Purdue about this. South Africa was in many ways the last colony, the last remnant or artifact of the colonial world to be liberated in 1994, when Nelson Mandela, in the country's first fully democratic election, was elected president. That really was the ultimate nail in the coffin of the history and legacy of colonialism. I'm sure that people could give me an example of, places where that's, Puerto Rico perhaps, but still, in terms of the creation of colonialism from the 19th century European empires, the liberation of South Africa was kind of the nail in the coffin. Now, I think South Africa is important for other reasons, not just because it's typical of that colonial remnant of an emerging market economy, but because in the 60s and 70s and 80s, it became the poster child for resistance to exploitation, right? South African whites clung to power and wealth at the expense of blacks, and they had plenty of international help doing it. Oh man, I hear a fire alarm. Okay, it stopped, all right? Because the era of decolonization was also, of course, as most of you know, the era of the Cold War. Sure, the US and other Western powers and economies began by 1960, let's say, to denounce the system of apartheid, to denounce the South African white regime. But they did so very cautiously, and I would say largely, at least at first, rhetorically. After all, the South African government posed as the defender of capitalism and Christian civilization in an Africa otherwise seen as going to the dogs, or at least going to the communists, right? So this is occurring at a moment in which all those decolonizing African countries from 1958 on, let's say, or 1960, are caught up in a battle for hearts and minds between the Soviet bloc and the West. The main liberation movement in South Africa, the African National Congress, that's Nelson Mandela's organization, seemed a little too red for comfort, okay? So even while Western diplomats complained about the mistreatment of blacks in South Africa, Western investment and loans and purchases of South African minerals and Krugerrands kept pouring in and essentially kept the economy booming. That 8% growth rate in the 1960s was closely linked to foreign investment and foreign purchases of South African goods, even while the government tightened its grip on blacks, passed more apartheid laws, instituted a draconian 90-day detention act, began using torture against its opponents as a regular feature of the police state that was necessary to keep people down. That coincided with massive investment growth from the Western economies, with no halt of Westerners doing business with and in South Africa. A nice example, let's say, I don't know if there are any surfing aficionados in the crowd here today, but the great surfing movies of the 1960s, Endless Summer, for example, right? The ultimate sign of 1960s hipsterism and global youth and consumption, that's all filmed in Jeffreys Bay, South Africa. No one's sitting there saying, wow, look at this great surfing spot. It's too bad it's marred by apartheid and only whites can use the beach. It wasn't understood that way. Okay, I think that's a very good example. However, the other thing that makes South Africa a really interesting parable, I think, is that the regime quickly discovered that you cannot sustain an economy if those who are doing the work, I wouldn't say they quickly discovered this, they slowly discovered this, if those doing the work are unable to buy the products that they produce, right? So this turned out by the 70s, I would say, to be a somewhat contradictory growth pattern. I think this is really, really important for thinking about business investment. If you're not paying your workers, essentially, Black South Africans mired in poverty couldn't consume, right? They were living at barely, if that, a subsistence level. They weren't buying refrigerators. They weren't buying automobiles. They weren't building homes. They were building shanty towns out of tin shacks. They weren't building swimming pools, right? That was just that tiny percentage of whites in the country who were engaged in this sort of consumption that would drive a domestic economy. So that meant that the South African economy depended on exports in order to grow, because they couldn't sell all these consumer durables to their working population. Moreover, as the economy got more complex, as economies do as they begin to grow, you need skilled labor, but you have no educated laborers because the entire system had been predicated on blocking the working population from gaining an education, from gaining skills, and from being able to consume. So while this looked great in the 1960s, by the 1970s, it began to look pretty feeble as a growth strategy. All right, so I really think that has some messages that we can take account of. Moreover, and here I think, and this is really what I started thinking about as I started thinking about how I'd give this talk, what we today call corporate social responsibility. I would argue that that concept and the strength of that movement was birthed by the anti-apartheid movement. All right, it was global opposition to apartheid that became the cutting edge in the 70s and the 80s for movements to insist that corporations behave ethically as well as seeking profit. I don't think we'd have today these calls on student campuses, on college campuses by students for divestment from fossil fuel companies, whatever you think of that, or insistence that the way to bring the gun manufacturers to heel is to boycott pension funds that invest in cult or whatever. All that strategy of boycott and disinvestment, that was really, at least in modern times, certainly you can date it back to sugar boycotts against slavery in the 19th century, in modern times was really generated by the anti-apartheid movement, okay? Shareholders, consumers, workers began to insist, began to insist that American or British or Dutch businesses and banks get out of South Africa, all right? They began to insist that products produced in South Africa be boycotted, not be purchased. So there you have that image of Coca-Cola. So if Coca-Cola was happy to be gracing the inauguration of the Voortrekker Monument in 1949, by the 1970s, there's a boycott against Coke because of its engagement in South Africa, okay? And finally, of course, the push that governments pass sanctions and prevent investment in South Africa from their nationals, and that pension funds and university endowments divest from businesses doing business in South Africa, right? So now, for those of you who do this kind of stuff, which maybe you do, business ethics and questions of that, the business community, as you might know, and probably won't surprise you, was very divided on this movement, on this anti-apartheid movement. Some businesses and shareholders and university trustees, one should add, rejected the idea of corporate responsibility altogether. So here we're really talking about the 1980s, okay? They insisted that they were in the business of profits and not ethics. And again, I think this is really a live issue, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about the NBA, the NFL, the so-called woke corporation movement now. This is, a replay of what was going on in the 1980s. So some business people said, look, we're in the business of making money. Sure, we feel bad about what's going on in South Africa, but not our problem. Okay. And, that was a position, a defensible position, perhaps, if, not necessarily from a moral aspect, from a legal and an economic aspect. Other business people embraced it wholeheartedly. And to me, the most interesting figure actually is from Indiana, surprisingly, I would say. And that was a guy named J. Irwin Miller, who was the head CEO of Cummins Diesel Engines in Columbus. Is anyone here from Columbus, Indiana? Or maybe some of you have been to Columbus, I don't know. And Cummins is a huge employer in Columbus, Indiana, which is about 35 miles east of Bloomington, where I work. And Miller was not only the CEO of Cummins Engine, but he also was the lay president of the National Council of Churches in the 1970s, I believe. Okay. And he had been, now it's interesting to point out that Miller was a Republican. He was what was called in the day a civil rights Republican, a Nelson Rockefeller Republican, a Richard Lugar Republican, if you remember Richard Lugar, senator from Indiana. So Miller was deeply committed to ethical business practices, to civil rights at home, and increasingly questioning Cummins's investments in South Africa, and eventually began to end them, and grew to embrace this movement of divestment and insist that the only way to force white South Africans to the bargaining table with the liberation movement was to make them hurt economically, was to insist that Western businesses would no longer continue to underwrite the system of apartheid and would get the hell out of South Africa. And Miller, in fact, and I managed to, before he passed away, I managed to get a 30-minute interview with Senator Lugar, who was nominally on the faculty of the Hamilton Lugar School here at IU. And he did do a 30-minute sit down with me. And I asked him one question. I said, why did you in 1986, as a Republican, even while the president, Ronald Reagan, continued to suggest that American businesses should continue to invest in South Africa, and indeed, that this would benefit South Africans. And Lugar was instrumental in overriding Reagan's veto of the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Sanctions Act of 1986, which really was, I would say, at least in terms of international pressure, the death knell of the apartheid regime. They had to come to terms at that point when it was clear that the U.S., instead of just talking one way, and meanwhile allowing them to do business, was really putting some teeth into this. And I asked Lugar, why were you willing to do that? Why were you willing to break with, some members of your party and indeed to override the president's veto and to whip, opposition to the veto? And he said, J. Irwin Miller. I was close friends with J. Irwin Miller. He had been advising me for 20 years on civil rights stuff in Indiana and nationally. And he told me this was the only way to break the back of apartheid, and I believed him. So I was very impressed by that. All right, that was very interesting to me. However, I do think Miller was an outlier in that regard, because the most common response at the time, and again, I think this is important for thinking about questions of business ethics today, was that business people would denounce apartheid, I think quite genuinely. They were horrified by it, but claimed to believe, and maybe did believe, that further investment in South Africa would in fact help erode it, and that disinvestment would only hurt the people it was designed to help. This is kind of ameliorative capitalism. Rather than a boycott, we should engage further. Constructive engagement, it was actually called by the Reagan administration. And I remember being a student activist in the 80s, and this was the debate. All right, this was the central debate of the time. Full disinvestment, which is what the internal opposition, at least the African National Congress and Archbishop Tutu were calling for, to really put the screws to the apartheid regime, versus what was called constructive engagement. Well, rather than divest and close our plants, the Ford Corporation should actually employ more people, train blacks to upgrade their skills, desegregate the inside of the plant, and put pressure on the South African government internally. But if we just shut our factory and come home, then all those workers, black workers, are going to be thrown out of work, and we're not going to be able to tell the South African government butkus. So that was the debate. I have my own position on that, weaker than it was perhaps 30 years ago. But I would say, and again, nominally, I understand this, right? In business classrooms, you often use the case study method. This would be a fantastic case study to develop around in a class of business ethics, the history of debates about divestment in the 1980s, because there were two sides to the debate. I don't think I admitted that when I was a student, but I would recognize it now. So if anyone's interested in doing that, I'd be happy to consult with you. I think I'll make it incredibly good. Maybe there is one for all I know. But now, ultimately, by the 1980s, apartheid did begin to crumble, with help especially from the outside, with external pressure from the divestment movement and the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Sanctions Act. Then what? Now I come to the last 9 minutes or 6 minutes or whatever, in which I will talk very briefly about post-apartheid South Africa. There's Miller, by the way. Now, this picture that I showed you to demonstrate the rampant economic inequality under apartheid actually, of course, is taken about 3 years ago, maybe 5, all right? So unfortunately, post-apartheid South Africa, at least in terms of social and economic inequality, looks a good deal like apartheid South Africa. And anyone who's been there, I think, can confirm that up to a point anyway. Mandela and the African National Congress and their allies in the trade union movement, very, very important in the 1980s. And indeed, the current president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, cut his teeth as the leader of the mine workers union in the 1980s, and he's the president now. Mandela, the ANC, the trade union movement, and let's be frank, the South African Communist Party, the red bugaboo that kept the West from really going full anti-apartheid in the 60s and the 70s, wasn't just a mirage or a fiction. Okay, the ANC was aligned with the Communist Party. The ANC and the Communist Party did, in fact, envision a socialist South Africa in the 1980s, as well as a democratic one. Okay, they got the latter, they got democracy, but they definitely did not get socialism or even democratic socialism in terms of a fair economy. The first years of the post-apartheid moment, let's say the early 1990s, the overall vision of the economy was governed by what was called the RDP, the Reconstruction and Development Program. This was, in essence, a Keynesian domestic investment, state spending, and redevelopment program that was supposed to boost the economy by investing in its people: housing, electricity, water, education, social services, and therefore believing that once people had a basic standard of living, they'd be able to consume again, and this would drive the economy. Okay, I think that's a very crude description, but I think that's a fair way to say that. But that was quickly outflanked by 1996 or 7 by something called GEAR, the Growth, Equity, and Redistribution, kind of as an afterthought, I must say, program, which was far more oriented to economic development. Well, let's just call it trickle-down economics, right? To creating a friendly business environment to stimulate foreign direct investment, and therefore that would employ people and that would drive the economy. Okay, so you have two, I would say, globally competing visions of how to make emerging market economies work. And the latter one, called pejoratively by academics neoliberalism, fundamentally won out. Now, whether there was a choice or not is a historical question, right? Because South Africa was in desperate need of economic investment from abroad, and they had to demonstrate growth in order to get more. So that created a dilemma, which I think is still 20 years later playing out, 25 years later, really. One thing that did happen, despite the persistent poverty and economic inequality driven by this terrible, so one could say here that GEAR, that neoliberal economics, didn't work to combat the biggest problem in South Africa, which persists, which is an incredibly high unemployment rate, right? And that probably understates the issue. You did have, of course, a reduction in poverty, racialized, I would say. So the colored and Indian people actually did not so bad, but they weren't as badly discriminated against or impoverished under apartheid. They had some social and economic capital, and the opening up of the country allowed some development there to crawl out of poverty. But Black Africans, particularly in rural areas, did not manage to really, the poverty rate was reduced during, during the first few years, but as you can see, and I'm going to stop in a minute, then it stopped being reduced. All right. I don't know how exact these figures are, but the basic point is that the post-apartheid government did a very good job, really, during the first 5 to 10 years in sort of bringing up a certain slice of deeply impoverished people. But that's essentially come to a standstill now. What you do have in South Africa is a de-racialized class of investors, entrepreneurs, capitalists, business people, right? The richest people in the country are still white, but some of them are also Black. The fanciest neighborhoods in the country, which are quite beautiful, are inhabited now by Black and white people. I'm just going to stop sharing here. So that's all to the good. Well, now, partly this has been driven what's called the Black Economic Empowerment Program, what we might call affirmative action, but far more than that, a sense that, you know, for any business to do business in South Africa, they really, really have to have a Black executive in the suite somewhere, if not the CEO, at least, and more than just a fig leaf or a face, someone who really is engaged. Now, unfortunately, what that often has created, and this has just come home to roost this week, was massive corruption. The Black Economic Empowerment Program, the ruling party, the ANC, and the desperation of white businesses to demonstrate their anti-racist bona fides created a huge possibility for corruption, which was fed at the trough by the former president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, who is wearing an orange jumpsuit today, who just this week was actually sent to prison for refusing to answer the court's charge of corruption. It would be as if Donald Trump refused to show up when he is indicted by Cyrus Vance in the coming months. Well, but in the United States, of course, we only indict the corporation, not the individual, so he's probably safe. But essentially, South Africa is in a really, really interesting moment now, where the corruption of the Zuma years is now going to either be extinguished because of Zuma going to jail, or simply you're going to have a change in the players, where you'll have a new corrupt group stepping forward to feed at the trough. But I'm hopeful, actually, because fundamentally South Africa is a democracy. But the economy, I would say, is still driven by enormous dependence on seeking direct foreign investment, and therefore an unfortunate reluctance to increase social spending significantly or to give trade unions enough power. So there's this constant balance that's being struck between a desire to create a friendly business climate and the necessity of redressing the apartheid deficit, which so many people in the country still labor under a generation later in terms of poverty, education, skills, living situations, and the like. So yeah, it's just 11:30. That's perfect. I'd be happy to answer questions either about South Africa today, although I haven't been there since the COVID disaster, which is still quite bad there. Very few people have been vaccinated, or about the history. Raj may have something to add since he apparently is quite familiar with the country as well.
I'm not an expert on South Africa. I'm a generalist who visited South Africa.
So anyhow, I'll leave it at that.
We are ready for questions. Alex, thank you so much. But we are ready for questions. There are two ways. Either you can raise your hand and ask your question and try to see what answers we can get to help overcome stereotypes, to convey the same to our students. And also, or you can type it in the chat box. So we have about 30 minutes for Q&A. And this is also the time for you to record in 2 or 3 or 4 words your initial reaction to Alex's presentation. Please do.
Well, let me add something, now a little more informally. I mean, of course, a lot of South Africans, obviously Black South Africans, and by Black, I mean people of color more generally in South Africa, insist quite correctly that it remains a racist country, and that, a lot of whites still harbor racist views, even if they're much shyer about expressing them. And there's no doubt that that's true. But as an American, when I go there, and my South African friends always reject this when I say it, but I find it amazingly different than the United States in terms of the comfort level that ordinary South Africans have interacting with people of other races, right? I'm sure there are racists, there's no question about it. But if you go into a restaurant or a bar in Johannesburg in particular, I would say, less so in Cape Town, I mean, every place is racially mixed, and racially mixed comfortably. If you go onto the University of Pretoria campus, University of Pretoria, if any of you have been there, I mean, that was one of the old Afrikaner campuses. That was the heart, the intellectual heart of white South Africa and white racism, at least outside of Stellenbosch, just 40 years ago. No Black people could go to University of Pretoria. The language of instruction was Afrikaans, the language of the white nationalists. The curriculum was very pro-apartheid. Now you walk onto that campus and Blacks and whites are just totally comfortably, socializing together in a way that strikes me every time I go as ahead of the United States on most college campuses in the United States. So I don't want to poo-poo. I mean, some people say, oh, things are as bad as they were under apartheid because the poverty and unemployment rates are so great. And of course, they are racialized. But I don't think that's true. I think there's been a lot of positive change. Not enough, but plenty of it. But I really would love to hear some questions. And I'd love to hear what, I was not entirely sure who I'm speaking to here. So, if you have questions about the business climate that I didn't address, or taking students there, which I've not done. I was supposed to do it this year, but I've brought South African students here on a tour of civil rights sites in the U.S. South. Mark DeStefano.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Alex, do you as a professor of history, do you work closely? I know this is the challenge for all of us. Do you work closely with members of the School of Business? I am a great believer in these interdisciplinary kinds of cooperations with languages, especially with history and culture. Do you have an ongoing relationship with people?
So, Mark, before I answer that question, tell me, are you affiliated with Kelley or not?
No, I'm actually I'm a language professor at St. Peter's University in New Jersey.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
The answer is no, and the blame entirely lies on the side of the business school. Let's be frank. Okay, so I've had some connections which have been very fruitful when individual professors who are about to take students to South Africa actually reach out to me and ask me to give a presentation much like the one I just did here, right? So, and that's been great, but that's only happened once or twice. Generally speaking, at least on the IU campus, the business school is a world apart, okay? They, I mean, obviously, like most business schools, they have a nicer building and nicer offices, and those of us in the humanities love to whine and complain about how much better they're treated. They make 3 times as much money as we do, et cetera, et cetera. But putting all those resentments aside, the biggest problem is they hoard their students. In other words, again, this isn't entirely their fault, but the IU system is set up so the coin of the realm is your students. So it is simply not in the interests of the Kelley School in terms of the university structure to say to their students, you must go take a course in history. You must go take a course in diversity in the US. In fact, what's going on the campus now, it's not just the business school. Every school is supposed to develop for the university system a diversity in the US course for their students. And I've been in these meetings and I keep saying to them, well, that's all well and good, but we have 200 of these courses in the college, 200 of them. Why don't you just tell your students to come take our classes and save yourself some time and effort? No, we can't do that. They have too many requirements in the school. So so that's a problem. I mean, it's not just a problem because of the business school, it's a structural problem at the university, but it's very frustrating. And so to the degree that we do have that kind of connection, it's really at the initiative of faculty members who are willing to seek us out and reach out. I guess I could do more of, you're reminding me that I should go back to Jamie Prenkert, for instance, at Kelley School, who has taken students to South Africa, and say, hey, Jamie, I think he's a dean now. I do this kind of stuff, let's do more of it. So, but in terms of curricular stuff, no, it just can't happen. It's a shame, in my view.
We have the same problem, obviously, on our campus. I mean, we have wonderful colleagues in the business department who always tell me that they're very interested, and I know that they are, in languages and in culture. But as you say, when it gets down to the actual curriculum, how do we, they have so many requirements with almost no electives. We get maybe a little bit, because they're required to take languages in the core, as one of my colleagues also writing in. And it's just, it's so frustrating. I remember once, I've been chairman for years. I remember once I was actually asked by an administrator, why do you think it's necessary for students to learn languages for the international business program? I couldn't believe my ears. I thought it was just some kind of but anyway, thank you.
If you want to do business in Africa, not so much South Africa, the rest of the continent, they have to learn Chinese.
Yeah.
Because of the Road and Belt Initiative.
The new imperialists, the people, if you go around Mozambique and you drive around the Mozambique coast around Maputo, every other building is a giant Chinese hotel or casino. Those are the people who are doing business there. So
thank you very much.
Well, I think I want to add something to what was just discussed. In Georgia, for example, you don't need foreign language for high school graduation, period. And even in college, I'm not quite sure, but I don't think you need to even take 1 or 2 courses in foreign language to be able to graduate from college. So we are a world unto ourselves in many ways.
See, I'd be curious. I don't know the answer. So what happens, at IU, the College of Arts and Sciences has language culture requirements, right? But sometimes people, and maybe Kelley Business School does, maybe it doesn't, but I'm sure they're not as rigorous, or maybe not as many courses. But even so, if they do, they teach them in-house rather than sending them to the college. And I don't blame them, because every student who registers for a college course is that much less dollars, essentially, that goes to the Kelley School from the center, because that's how resources get distributed. But it's really a shame. So sometimes students, try to get out of the College of Arts and Sciences so they can dodge those requirements. Or if those requirements become universal across schools, like diversity in the US, then we have this massive duplication of effort. I've been in these meetings where there are 12 different schools designing 12 different diversity in the US courses to fulfill the requirement. Now, sometimes it makes sense because it's discipline specific, but sometimes a little bit of sharing and playing to strengths wouldn't hurt. Like if I said to one of my graduate students, well, you're doing a dissertation in business history, and I don't know how to teach you this stuff. You should probably go take a course over at the Kelley School. That's what I wouldn't say, well, let's develop a course, I don't know how to teach this stuff. I'd say, go do it with someone who knows what they're talking about. So, but yes, Mark, another nice way, again, we often face barriers with this, is, trying to cross list, but across schools, it's really hard. So just, I would love to go work with, I should probably talk to Jamie about this idea of a case study based on the divestment movement. for a course on the business ethics. That would be really, really interesting. So maybe the solution is to find, rather than entire courses, just very specific, case studies that professors in other disciplines can offer.
I think you read the question. Incredible. How does the US expect to compete in a global economy with this kind of an attitude?
It's going to be tough. I mean, but it's going to be tough, right? And again, so much of this, to my mind, is a lag from when the U.S. was the big kid on the block, starting in 1945, and was not only the dominant economy, but was the shot caller. But with the end of the Cold War and with, all these rapidly emerging economies, and with China essentially being as important as the United States in the global economy, yeah, I mean, it's a different territory than it was in 1960 or even 1980. So we need to catch up, it seems.
Any other question? If, to the extent you commented on the relationship between foreign direct investment and South African economy, what alternate models are available for the current president or the next generation of leaders from the ANC, which would be different from what the traditional capitalistic approach has prescribed for the world?
That's a really good question, Raj. I'm not sure I can answer that. I mean, the most dynamic change in the South African economy, as you probably know, over, let's say, the past 40 years, is the decline of importance of the mineral sector. I mean, it's still very, very important, right? I mean, they have these giant platinum mines, and I mean, those are very, very significant, but they don't loom as large in the economy as they used to. They employ many fewer people than they did at the heyday of apartheid. The most powerful corporations in the country still are in the mining sector, but it just doesn't have as much social weight as it did, let's say, 40 years ago. So, and obviously the leadership recognizes this. So the economy needs to be diversified. I think what Ramaphosa, the current president, is doing, and he's a complicated figure, but I think he's obviously very smart in that he recognizes the first thing that has to happen is the country has to move upward on that corruption index, right? And so putting Zuma in jail, and then there was another extremely corrupt ANC crony in the Free State, Ace Magashula, who's been brought to heel. So combating corruption, which is what Ramaphosa is doing, whether it works or not is another matter. But in terms of PR, sending Zuma to jail sends a giant message to the world that South Africa is, combating corruption, and it's going to zoom up on that annual corruption index. So that's really positive in terms of investment. Then the question is sectoral, right? So mining, that's not going to generate any more jobs in the future. That's done. It'll always be economically important, but it's not going to be a job creator. You have this enormous unemployment rate. So I guess the recognition, again, is going back to investment in skills. Education is really, really key. To give people the cultural capital so they can actually work in the economy. And then, what's...
That's a very expensive proposition, though.
It is. Well, this is the problem. So it takes spending at first rather than later. So obviously the tourist sector is fantastically possible, right? In terms of particularly Europe, because Americans, it is a long trip. So, and lots of people like to travel there, but that means getting a grip on crime, because there's ain't no lying about it. You have to be careful in South Africa.
Very careful.
As you're led to believe.
I almost lost my shirt.
So I'm sure, again, Ramaphosa's not an idiot. So combating crimes makes the country safer for travel. It's really killed them, of course. COVID has been horrible. But growing the service sector, which means, for better or worse, tourism, and getting people, I mean, the other thing is South Africa, which was, as the mining sector declined, it was really a pretty growth, there was a growth paradigm going on in primary manufacturing, in textiles, for example, and metals and chemicals. These are really powerful engines of the South African economy, both under apartheid and in the 1990s, automobiles. But that, like the rest of the industrialized world, they've been undercut and jobs. I mean, the textile sector has collapsed in the past 25 years, just as it has in the United States. It's moved on. I mean, as cheap as South African labor is, it is unionized. And so production has moved from South Africa up into Lesotho or eastward, right, or to Mauritius. So that's really tough. So I don't know. So there has to be a new way of creating jobs that will generate income that will in turn generate the economy. If I knew the answer to that, Cyril Ramaphosa would hire me as you know, a communist minister. There still are communist ministers there, but I think they're going to have to bank on tourism. Unfortunately, that's what the country really has. The incredible
natural landscape.
Yep.
We have time for at least 2 or 3 more questions. This is also a time for you to record your observations in 2, 3, 4, 5 words. So please either raise your hand or enter the question in the chat box, please.
So I would also add, again, just thinking about the economic future. I mean, you know, it's still the largest and most powerful economy on the African continent, maybe rivaled by Nigeria.
Oh, it's one of the most prosperous stock exchanges in all of the African continent.
Johannesburg is a world city and a world-class city, right? With, you know, incredible energy, incredible labor force, fashion and art and culture and you know, restaurants. And I mean, there are a lot of potential drivers here. There's a lot of promise in South Africa. And so, again, we'll see how it plays out, but I think this week may be a turning point because of the willingness to actually combat corruption.
I hope he doesn't come out in 10 days.
Even if he comes out, he's going to face the charges. I mean, it's clear that Ramaphosa, there's been a struggle going on within the ANC for the past 4 or 5 years between the corrupt wing and the wing that is less corrupt, but very actually interested in governance, right? Not just interested in looting the economy, as Zuma and his cronies were. And so it seems that within the ANC, which is the ruling party, elected democratically, that the governance people who rake off less for themselves have won, unless there's a real change in the next 2 or 3 weeks, like a coup, which there won't be. So I'm surprised there aren't more questions, guys. I'd love to hear more questions. It's really one of the most interesting countries in the world.
Let's pause for a few seconds. Maybe somebody will type in some questions and things like that. Okay. Anybody out there?
I've got to go. I've got another meeting at noon. So
no, I understand.
This was a pleasure.
First of all,
do stay in touch. So we obviously have mutual interest. And thank you all for listening.
If you can send me a PDF of the PowerPoint slide, I would really appreciate that.
Sure.
So that I can share it with the people.
I will do that either right now or this afternoon.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks,
sir.
all.
I want to thank you very much. Again, let's give him a hand. Thank you. Before we break for lunch, I want to share a couple of things with you.